I still remember that moment, Lily's tiny nightgown hanging from a tree branch deep in the cold forest, like a silent challenge from the darkness. 6 days of searching, no trace, no cries. My mother saw something no one believed, a truth the whole community wanted to bury. This isn't just a simple family disappearance, it's a chilling mirror of silence and suspicion. If you think this is just an ordinary family story, then you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch our gripping and emotional episodes. Before the darkness took hold, I believed the forest and family would keep those 2 little children safe. The first light touched the tips of the tall grass that bent gently under the morning wind. It was a modest, whispering wind, the kind that makes a child look up and wonder if something unseen had just passed by. Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia, was still wrapped in the kind of quiet only found in places far removed from cities where life moved slower and hearts beat softer. The Sullivan home sat nestled between 2 large maple trees that had stood for generations, their trunks thick and patient. The house wasn't much white paint peeling in places, a porch that creaked under the weight of time, and a garden out front that refused to grow anything but wildflowers. But it was theirs. More importantly, it was where Lilly and Jack Sullivan played. Lilly, just turned 6, was running barefoot across the damp lawn, her hair still tangled from sleep, wearing an oversized pink hoodie that once belonged to her cousin. Jack, 4, followed behind her, clutching a plastic dinosaur in one hand and a stuffed rabbit in the other. His rubber boots, 2 sizes too big, flopped against his feet like drumsticks. They moved together in the chaotic harmony only siblings knew, laughing, tripping, shouting each other's names like it was their own secret language. Behind the kitchen window, Emily Sullivan stood quietly, pouring the last of the coffee into a chipped ceramic mug that read, "Best Mom Ever," though the paint had mostly faded. Her face was half shadowed in the morning light, worn from too many sleepless nights and unspoken worries. She stared out the window, watching her children, and for a brief moment her lips curled into a smile, soft, almost apologetic. She sipped the coffee slowly, like the silence was something sacred. Out by the shed, Graham Sullivan, her husband, was bent over a small workbench, sanding down a piece of cedar for the birdhouse he'd promised to finish weeks ago. The door to the shed was open, and the scent of sawdust hung in the air like a memory. Graham whistled an old folk tune one his father used to sing when fixing things, and it wandered across the yard, unnoticed by the children. A blue jay called out from a tree branch above, sharp and persistent, but it too was ignored. The whole morning felt like something fragile, like a single thread could pull it apart. Lily had just spotted a toad under the edge of the porch and was crouched low, whispering to Jack not to scare it. Jack, in his usual Jack-like way, immediately reached out to poke it with the dinosaur's tail. The toad leapt. Both children screamed and laughed, collapsing into the wet grass. Their joy was a sound that filled the space between fence posts and far-off tree lines. A sound that, for those who knew what would follow, would become haunting. From inside the house, Emily glanced again toward the yard, and then to the clock above the stove, 7:21 a.m. She had 20 minutes before her conference call. She turned, placing her mug in the sink, and walked toward the hallway, calling out through the open back door, "Lily, Jack. 5 more minutes, okay?" Then inside, a small, high-pitched, "Okay," Mom floated back. She didn't know which one said it. Maybe both. Emily disappeared down the hall. The kitchen light flicked off. The wind blew again, just a little harder. Jack looked up suddenly. He squinted toward the woods that edged their backyard, where the tall grass grew wild and a narrow deer trail cut into the tree line. He didn't say anything, but his steps began drifting that way, just a few feet, just far enough for the light to change the way it does under thick leaves. Lily stood brushing grass from her knees. She looked back at the house, hesitating. Then, with a frown that didn't belong on the face of a 6-year-old, she followed him. The screen door at the back of the house creaked as it moved slightly with the wind. And then it happened. The laughter stopped. The birds still chirped. The wind still rustled the trees. But something in the air shifted. That invisible, impossible-to-name silence settled in. The kind of silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The kind of silence that suggests the world just blinked. Emily re-entered the kitchen 10 minutes later with a notepad and her laptop. She stood at the sink again, scanning the yard. Empty. She waited. Maybe they were behind the shed. Maybe Graham had taken them around the side to look for eggs in the chicken coop. She opened the screen door and stepped out. Lily, she called. Jack. No answer. She walked to the porch, the boards cool under her bare feet. Graham, she called again, louder this time. Nothing. By now she was moving faster down the steps across the lawn. Her eyes darted left to right, scanning for that ridiculous pink hoodie, those two big rubber boots. But all she saw was the stillness of the yard, a plastic dinosaur lying abandoned near the flower bed. Graham emerged from the shed a moment later, wiping his hands on a towel, confused. What's going on? They were just here, just right here, Emily said, panic not yet fully formed, but rising. Graham's brows knitted. He looked toward the trees. He started toward the edge of the lawn, Emily beside him. Their pace quickening with each step, they began calling out louder. Lily, Jack, come on now. It's not funny. But there was no answer. Just the wind again, this time colder. And then Emily stopped. A few feet into the wild grass, glistening with morning dew, lay a single tiny sneaker. Pink Velcro strap. Turned slightly on its side. Still tied. Emily bent down. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. She clutched it against her chest and looked up at her husband. They're gone, she whispered, her voice cracking open like thin ice. They're just gone. The camera would pull slowly away from them, an overhead shot rising, revealing how small they were. Two parents in a sea of grass and trees, completely unaware that the next few days would change not only their lives, but the very definition of the word safe for everyone who heard their story. And then cut to black. A single title appears on screen, white on black. The disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Fade to the soft sound of wind chimes. Then silence. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the single sneaker in her hand, still slightly warm from the morning sun. Her pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out Graham's voice as he called out again for the children. Lily, Jack, if you're hiding, this isn't funny. She wanted to believe it was a game. Hide and seek. Children do this all the time. But something in her body screamed otherwise. A primal maternal signal that doesn't speak in words, only in dread. She ran. No direction. Just ran toward the edge of the woods, stumbling over uneven patches of dirt and stone, her eyes scanning furiously. Graham moved behind her faster now, his voice breaking as he shouted. The trees seemed to lean in each one, a shadow keeping secrets. She turned back toward the house, shouting so loud it tore at her throat. Call someone. Graham froze for a second, then bolted. He tripped once on the back steps before flinging the screen door open. Inside, his fingers fumbled the buttons on the landline phone, dialing 911 with a clumsy urgency that made the numbers beep twice. The dispatcher answered calm and professional, as if that alone could stem the bleeding panic. Yes, we can't find our kids. They were just here. They were right here. Our backyard. We live on Eastfield Lane, just outside Lansdowne Station. The woman on the other end switched tones immediately. Procedure activated. What are their names? Lily, she's 6. Jack, he's 4. When was the last time you saw them? 15 minutes. Maybe 20. They were in the yard. They were playing. And now, gone. Silence on the line, and then stay where you are. Units are on the way. When Emily returned to the yard, her face was pale, her lips nearly colorless. She held Jack's stuffed rabbit found near the garden fence, clenched so tightly the seams had begun to pull. Graham approached her slowly, whispering, "They're coming. The cops. They're coming." She nodded almost without realizing it. Her eyes wouldn't stop scanning, again and again, looking where she'd looked already. Under the porch, behind the shed, down the gravel path to the road, then to the woods, always to the woods. Sirens came 15 minutes later. The blue and red lights didn't comfort her. They shattered something, as if the situation had now passed through a doorway no longer explainable by normal rules. The moment uniforms appear, it stops being just a bad moment. It becomes a case. 2 officers stepped out. The older one, Sergeant Keating, had that hardened but tired face you only get after 20 years of responding to other people's worst days. The younger one, Officer Marquez, looked fresh out of training, trying not to let his eyes betray fear. Keating spoke first. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, we understand your children are missing." Graham nodded. Emily couldn't speak. She just stared. "Did you see or hear anything unusual this morning?" "No, nothing." Graham shook his head, trying to steady his voice. They were just playing in the yard. Then they weren't. Keating turned to Marquez. Get the map. From the squad car's trunk, they unfolded a large topographical map of the region. The lines and shading looked like a giant's fingerprint rolling. Forest creeks, gullies, animal paths, abandoned cabins. This is your property, Keating said, pointing to a shaded square. You're surrounded by nearly 4,000 hectares of woodland. Dense, underdeveloped. The kind of place GPS stops caring about after a mile. Emily stared at the map as if it might bleed. We'll start a ground search immediately. Every direction. We'll notify search and rescue and request K9. But I need to ask, his voice changed, is there anyone who might want to hurt you? Any custody issues? Anyone visiting recently? Emily snapped back. No, we keep to ourselves, Graham added. We don't have enemies. And they wouldn't run off. Not like this. Keating nodded, but wrote something down. We ask everything, ma'am. Even the things that feel impossible. As if summoned by fear itself, dark clouds began to crawl across the sky. The temperature dipped. A hawk called out overhead, sharp and dissonant. By the time the first search and rescue unit arrived, the wind had picked up. The old maple trees shivered, and the fields that had once seemed so open now felt like they were closing in. Emily watched as men and women in orange vests and headsets stepped out of pickup trucks and vans. They moved like ants with purpose. Some carried drones, others thermal scanners, and a few brought out K9 units, Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, already barking with eagerness and discipline. Keating pulled aside one of the handlers. Deploy the dogs north and west. Focus near the creek and the tree line. No signs of recent vehicle movement, so it's likely on foot if it's them. Emily gripped the porch railing like she might fly away. Her knuckles turned white. Her whole body was a knot of muscle and grief, but she didn't cry. She didn't blink. She just stared into the forest as the teams disappeared between the trees. Hours began to move like wet cement. A neighbor showed up, an old woman named Martha Kane, holding a thermos and prayer beads. I heard she whispered, as if saying it too loud would make it real. I can help, look. And she wasn't alone. By mid-afternoon, there were over 60 volunteers combing the woods. Locals, farmers, teenagers, a retired RCMP officer, even the postman. Every face was the same, a mixture of panic, disbelief, and the quiet dread of knowing every hour lost was a breath further away from hope. The wind kept picking up. The woods began to moan with it. Radios crackled. Drones buzzed like giant insects overhead. The dogs barked, pulled, whimpered. But no one found anything, not a sock, not a hair, not a single sound. Not yet. Inside the Sullivan home, the living room had been transformed into a command post. Maps, notes, photos of Lilly and Jack tacked to a corkboard. One picture of Lilly in her school uniform missing a tooth stared down at them all like a question with no answer. Emily refused to sit. She paced, clutched the rabbit. Sometimes she'd whisper to herself. Names, fragments of lullabies, or just nothing. Graham, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Sat in a kitchen chair, elbows on knees, face buried in his hands. Every so often he'd whisper a prayer he didn't believe in. It was Marquez who brought in the first possible lead. A man walking a dog reported hearing a child's voice in the woods at dawn. Could have been imagination, he said. Could have been a coyote. He didn't say what everyone else was thinking could have been real. Could have been the last sound. Keating ordered that area to be searched immediately. At 3:07 p.m., one of the dogs, Ranger, a 4-year-old German Shepherd, began barking near a marshy stretch of brush. Its handler raised a hand and the team closed in. Emily was there too, having followed quietly, without anyone stopping her. They gathered around a patch of flattened grass. There, barely visible beneath the leaves, was a small footprint. Just one. Everyone fell silent. The only sound was the dog's panting. It was a child's print, left foot, no shoes. Emily dropped to her knees, reaching toward it. But someone held her back. Don't disturb it, a voice said. We'll photograph it first. It was Keating who gently pulled her away. That's her size, she whispered. That's Lilly. The team marked the spot with a fluorescent flag. A drone flew overhead, capturing everything in infrared. Still, no sign of movement. No warm bodies. No clear path. The footprint pointed west, but the terrain there turned steep and thick, and then it started to rain. A cold, unforgiving rain that turned everything into mud. The volunteers kept going. They didn't stop. Not as the light began to fade, not as the dogs grew tired, not even when the radio reported no new signs. Inside the house, someone had lit a candle in the windowsill. One of the volunteers, an older man who'd lost a child of his own long ago, stood watching the flame flicker through the glass. He whispered, mostly to himself, "God help us. The woods don't give back easy." The search had been going for 31 hours. Somewhere between exhaustion and obsession, the line blurs. Voices grow hoarse, eyes stop blinking, and the forest begins to breathe in ways it didn't before. There's something about the Nova Scotia woods, how they hold silence like it's a weapon, how the trees seem to lean a little closer when you're alone. For those who've lived near them their whole lives, it's understood some paths aren't meant to be followed, not out of superstition, out of instinct. That afternoon, as the wind sharpened and the canopy swayed like something restless, had woken up a man named Roy Fletcher, retired 72, widowed, and the kind of neighbor who still brought firewood to others. Unasked, paused near a moss-covered outcrop 3 kilometers northwest of the Sullivan property. He had joined the search on foot against the better judgment of his own arthritis. "I may be old," he had told the coordinator that morning, "but I know these woods better than anyone." He did, and that's why he stopped when he did. The air around him had gone unnaturally still, not quiet still, like the forest had paused its breathing to watch him. Roy turned, not sure what had caught his attention. Then he saw it. Nestled half beneath a fern, impossibly clean, impossibly out of place, was a doll. He crouched slowly. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a child's toy in the woods. Hunters dropped things, families lost things on picnics. But this was different. The doll had a yellow dress and glass eyes, one of which was slightly chipped. Its hair, a dull synthetic brown, was braided neatly down the side. Roy didn't touch it. He just stared. He called it in. Within 10 minutes, officers had arrived. Keating stood over the doll, his jaw clenched. "That hers?" he asked Emily, who had insisted on coming when she heard the radio call. Emily didn't say anything. She walked slowly, every step a negotiation with gravity. Then she saw it. The moment her eyes landed on the doll, something inside her shattered with absolute certainty. "That's Daisy," she whispered. "That's Lily's. She sleeps with it every night," Graham added, his voice from behind. Keating nodded to the crime tech, who took photos, tagged the location, and collected the doll in a sealed evidence bag. Then came the part that froze them all. No footprints, not Lily's, not Jack's, not adult prints, not drag marks, not even disturbed earth. The moss was intact. The grass was upright, as if the doll had materialized from thin air and settled gently on the forest floor. Marquez asked what everyone else was too afraid to. "Could it have been dropped from a drone?" Keating shook his head. "No burn, no damage, no scuffs." Roy, who had stepped back and was standing quietly with his arms crossed, spoke with a grim certainty. "There are parts of these woods that don't want to be walked through," he said softly. Marquez blinked. "Sir." The old man turned, eyes like weathered stone. "There's a place out by the creek bend. Nobody goes there. Not since the frost took the Monroe boy in '81. Found his shoes lined up by the river. No footprints then either." Keating's face hardened. "We're not going there right now, Roy." "I'm not saying spooks took the kids," Roy muttered. "I'm saying some places don't forget." Back at the command center, the doll was being tested for fingerprints. None found. No smudges, no oils, nothing. Emily sat in silence, replaying every detail from the morning of the disappearance. "I didn't see her carry Daisy outside," she said finally. "She usually brings her, but that morning, I didn't see it." "She must have gone back inside for it," Graham reasoned. "No," Emily said more firmly now. "I would have heard the door. I was right there." The implication hung in the air. If the doll wasn't brought outside by Lily, how did it end up in the woods? Marquez brought in a wildlife tracker named Zane Keller, a wiry man with eyes like a hawk and a permanent layer of dirt under his nails. He inspected the area where the doll had been found. No deer, no raccoon, no trails. Whatever put that there didn't come through the woods, or it didn't leave a trace. Emily whispered to herself, barely audible, or it didn't walk at all. Keating looked up. "What was that?" She shook her head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Something had changed. The energy, the feel of the investigation. What began as a desperate search was now laced with unease. That night, a few searchers reported hearing a child's voice deeper in the woods, soft, almost song-like. When they followed it, it stopped. Thermal drones were sent to the area. Nothing showed. Not a heat signature. Not an animal. Roy, back in his cabin, lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. He didn't smoke much anymore, not since his wife passed. But tonight, something sat heavy on his chest. He took out an old map, older than the one the RCMP was using, and traced a line from the Sullivan property to the place the doll was found. He marked it in pencil too clean, too quiet. Too soon. On the floor beside him, his dog whimpered in its sleep. The next morning, Emily found herself standing alone near the edge of the woods. Her breath came in shallow clouds. She hadn't slept. She stared into the trees, listened. "Lily," she whispered, "if you're in there, please, just give me something, anything." The wind shifted. Something moved softly. A pine cone dropped from a high branch and bounced twice before coming to a stop. She turned away, blinking tears into the cold. From behind her, a low chime sounded. A single soft metallic tone. Wind through an old bell, maybe. But they didn't have one. She didn't turn back. Later that afternoon, Keller found a second item. This time a juice box unopened, sitting upright on a stone beside a shallow creek. No dirt on it. No bite marks. No punctures. As if it had just come off a grocery shelf. The date on the box, 2 days expired. The flavor apple raspberry, Jack's favorite. Emily nearly collapsed. "I packed those," she whispered. "The morning they went missing." "How many?" Keller asked. "2. One's still in your fridge?" Marquez added, checking his notes. Emily nodded. "So this is the other," Keller said. "Out here. Untouched." The creek flowed beside them, slow and muddy. The drone overhead captured everything. Again, no prints. "Where are they?" Emily asked, voice cracking. Graham stepped forward, gripping her arm. "We'll find them. We will." She turned to him, and for the first time in hours, looked him full in the face. "And what if we're not supposed to?" He flinched. "Don't say that." But she wasn't speaking out of fear. She was speaking out of knowing. Something about this was wrong in a way that didn't fit into forms or timelines or procedures. Not criminal, not accidental. Something other. Back at headquarters, the files began to shift from physical search to behavioral analysis. They brought in a child psychology expert. They reviewed every second of home footage. They re-interviewed neighbors. Nothing new. But the unease was spreading. A second volunteer, a woman from the nearby reservation, and refused to return after her first day searching. "There are things in that forest older than your cities," she said. "If they've taken the children, you better hope they return them." Keating wrote it off as folklore, but that night, in the temporary trailer where he reviewed footage, the wind blew so hard the windows howled. He poured himself a coffee, sat back, and watched the drone feed on loop, frame by frame, and then he saw it. One of the thermal scans, just for a second, showed a heat signature. Child-sized, moving fast, but it wasn't walking. It was gliding. He leaned in, heart climbing. He rewound, played again. Gone. Just forest. Keating rubbed his face hard and stood up. Outside, the wind died down. A branch creaked. The trailer door rattled once hard. He opened it. Nothing there. But far off toward the tree line, just visible, a yellow shape slipped behind the trunks, too far to chase, too strange to understand. And all he could hear was the doll's name echoing in his skull like a whisper. Daisy. The wind had calmed. But inside the Sullivan house, a storm had just begun, the kind you can't see on radar. The kind that creeps in behind the eyes, settles in the chest, and speaks in a voice no one else can hear. The sun had dipped past the tree line by the time Detective Marlene Duval arrived. She was older than she looked, sharp-featured steel-gray hair pulled tight in a bun that gave her no-nonsense face an edge. She didn't wear her badge on her belt. She didn't need to. Marlene didn't believe in spooks or shadows or legends. She believed in patterns, behavior. The stories people told without knowing they were telling them. And she always started with the parents. Emily and Graham Sullivan sat in separate corners of their modest living room, a quiet space made quieter by the absence of toys. No blocks, no blankets, no giggles echoing down the hallway. Just the clock ticking like a metronome, marking the beat of their guilt. "Let's talk about your kids," Marlene said gently, flipping open her notebook. "Start from the beginning. I don't want the facts. I want the feel of them." Emily stared at the coffee table. Graham rubbed his palms into his jeans. Lily's the strong one, Emily said eventually. She's small but fierce, always looking out for Jack. And Jack, Emily smiled, but it hurt her to do it. He cries when he sees worms on the sidewalk. He thinks they're lost. Marlene nodded. Tell me about the last week. Any changes? Fights anything unusual? The silence stretched. Graham was the one who broke it. There was something. Emily's eyes darted to him. She drew on the wall, he continued, voice dry. A few days before, a big mural. Crayons. Jack joined in. Marlene leaned forward, and I lost it, he admitted. Yelled. Loud. Scared them both. Emily turned away, jaw clenched. I didn't touch them, Graham added quickly. I shouted. Harder than I should have. And how did they react? Lily didn't cry. Jack did. She hugged him. Said, don't worry. We'll go to the forest. The forest doesn't yell. That last sentence hung in the room like a shiver. Marlene's pen paused mid-stroke. You tell anyone that before, she asked. Emily shook her head. Why not? Because I didn't want to believe it meant anything. Emily whispered. Marlene took a breath, shifted. I've worked cases like this before, she said, quieter now. Sometimes kids leave not because someone takes them, but because they're running from something. Graham stood suddenly defensive. We are not abusers. I'm not accusing you, Marlene replied. But I need the whole picture. He turned away, fists tight. Flashback. 2 nights before the disappearance. The camera pulls through the Sullivan hallway past hanging coats and a scuffed-up tricycle. Light spills from under the bathroom door. Inside, Jack's eyes are red. He's curled in a towel damp from bathwater, holding his breath like a scared animal. Lily stands guard outside the door. Her face is set jaw tight. Downstairs, Graham's voice rises. Crayons are for paper, not for walls. What were you thinking? The slam of a drawer. Emily tries to intervene, but her voice is thin. Graham again. You think money grows on trees? You think your little scribbles are cute? Upstairs, Lily whispers to Jack. It's okay. The forest doesn't yell. Back to the present. Marlene doesn't say anything for a long time. She simply scribbles something in her notes. Outside, the porch light buzzes and flickers. Inside the makeshift command center, another officer, Corporal Dana Wu, receives a knock on the trailer door. Got something, the text says, from the neighbor's security cam. A flash drive is handed over. Wu plugs it into the monitor. Static timestamps shaky footage of a gravel path. Then movement. 2 small figures, one in a pink hoodie, one with something plush clutched in his hands. Running toward the trees. Alone. Wu's eyes narrow. She rewinds, plays again. Slower. No adult, no force. Just the children running with purpose. Not laughing, not playing. Focused. Determined. She calls Keating. Marlene is already there when the video is played for the Sullivans. Emily gasps. Graham steps back, eyes wide. That's that morning, he says. That's them. Where were you? Marlene asks gently. In the shed, Graham replies. She was in the kitchen. We thought they were in the yard. Emily finishes stunned. They must have gone through the fence break behind the tool shed. They're heading straight for the woods, Wu murmurs. Not wandering. They're choosing it. The footage ends. The room is silent. And for the first time since the search began, the narrative fractures. They weren't taken. They left. On their own. But why? The emotional ground shifts beneath everyone. Suspicions soften. The community that had begun whispering behind closed doors now turns its gaze inward. Toward themselves. How many of them had shouted at their own kids? How many had ignored signs that a child was hurting? How many had told themselves, they're too young to understand, when in truth, children understand everything? Marlene closes her notebook. Sometimes she says the worst pain isn't a bruise. It's being unseen. Graham lowers himself back onto the couch like his body has forgotten how to stand. Emily wipes her eyes. They didn't even take shoes. No, Marlene says. They took each other. The image from the video burns into the minds of everyone who sees it. 2 small figures disappearing into a line of trees swallowed by a forest that doesn't yell. The rain had stopped by morning, but the forest floor was now a soaked, heavy quilt of mud and rotting leaves. The kind of ground that records everything, prints blood, broken branches, but also consumes them just as fast. It was on the 3rd day that something paused. Search teams were rotating out. Dogs rotated. Fresh boots on tired trails. Everyone was starting to move more like machines than people, but not Axel. Axel was a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois trained for scent search and obedience under stress. He had tracked fugitives through fire zones, pulled bodies from avalanche wreckage. He had never refused a command. Until now. They had brought him to a clearing near the northern ridgeline, where drone footage had shown something unusual the night before. Axel clipped to his handler's vest, pulled forward at first ears, up nose twitching. Then he stopped, right at the edge of a thick, muddy pool, no more than 10 feet across. Stagnant water brackish, framed by a twisted arc of birch roots like the forest itself had once recoiled and froze that way. The handler nudged him forward. "Go on, boy. Track." But Axel sat down, not crouched, not alert. Sat, refused to move, not defiant, afraid. The handler tried again, voice firm. "Axel, seek." The dog whined, low, backed up. That had never happened before. 2 other dogs brought in similar response. No interest in the water, but none of them would cross that space. "Something's wrong here," the handler muttered, staring at the pool. They flagged the location, took photos, sent a sample of the mud for lab analysis. When Marlene Duval arrived 20 minutes later, she bent down by the water's edge, her gloved fingers running across a faint depression near the roots. A partial print, heel-shaped, small, too small to be adult. "Lily," she murmured, then she saw it. Embedded at an unnatural angle, half sunk into the muck, a strand of white cloth, delicate, almost transparent. Like it had been torn from something soft, something worn. She held it up to the light. It shimmered. "I want satellite footage of this area," she told the team lead. "All angles, all time stamps." They complied. What came back that afternoon made the room fall silent. The drone footage from just after dawn 2 days ago. Thermal overlay, scanned for heat and motion. Most of it was blurry, but one frame, just one, stood out. Near the tree line, where the open clearing met the dark wall of pine, stood a figure. Not a child, an adult, still, upright, looking toward the direction the children had been seen running. The next frame gone. No trail, no second appearance. No one reported being in that location. Marlene froze the image and zoomed. The figure was tall, possibly male. Wearing something baggy, a coat, a hood, impossible to tell. But the posture not moving gave it away. Not part of the search crew, not one of theirs. And that changed everything. She called Keating. "You need to see this." 10 minutes later, the photo was tacked to the whiteboard back at the command center. Red circle drawn around the blurry shadow. People stared. Marquez broke the silence. "Could be a hunter, poacher. In that jacket," Keating muttered. "Too long, too broad at the shoulders." Marlene added, "No weapon, no pack, no gear." "So who the hell is it?" Wu asked. No one had an answer. But Roy Fletcher, watching quietly from the side, said 4 words that turned the room colder. "Could be Henry Cord." Heads turned. Marquez frowned. "Who?" Roy pulled a folded page from his pocket. A newspaper clipping faded and creased. "Man lives up past the power line trail. Not on the grid. Hasn't been seen in town in years." Marlene took the clipping and read. 1999. Missing child. Henry Cord questioned. Released. She scanned faster. A 5-year-old boy had vanished from a rest stop 20 kilometers north of the current search zone. Cord, then in his 40s, had been spotted nearby living out of a cabin on unregistered land. No charges were ever filed, but rumors never died. "Why hasn't he been followed up on?" Keating asked. Roy shrugged. "No one goes near him, and he doesn't come out." Marlene stood. "We're going to him." They found the cabin 2 hours before sunset, deep in the woods, far from marked trails, surrounded by a tangle of fallen trees and rusted fencing that looked more like a trap than a barrier. The structure was half buried in undergrowth, with sheets of metal nailed across windows and soot climbing up the chimney like a scar. No movement inside. Marlene approached the front door, her hand hovering over the holster at her hip. She knocked. No answer. Knocked again, louder. "Henry Cord, Nova Scotia RCMP. Step out." Silence. Then a click. A creak. The door opened just enough to show one eye. Yellowed, cloudy. A raspy voice followed. "You don't belong here." Marlene didn't blink. "We need to talk." The door opened further, slowly. Henry Cord stood there, barefoot, coat open, over a gray undershirt, his skin sun-leathered and thin. His hair had once been red. Now it hung like damp straw. "I didn't take them," he said flatly. "We didn't ask yet," Marlene replied. "You're here because the woods swallowed something." "That's what they do." Keating stepped beside her. "Mind if we look around?" Henry shrugged. "Won't find anything. But sure. Come on in. Just don't touch the bells." Inside, the air was thick with sage smoke and mildew. Shelves lined with feathers, jars of dirt, fragments of old toys. We whispered to Marquez. "What is this place?" Cord answered without turning. "It's protection. For me. For them. There's something old out here. Been here before me. Before this land had fences." He pointed toward a strange knotted rope above the fireplace. It swayed despite the still air. "Children come into these woods and vanish because no one listens to the trees anymore," he said. Marlene scanned the walls. There were drawings. Children, stick figures, circles, names. Lilly Jack Benny, 1999. Alyssa, 2007. Megan, 2014. She turned to him. "These names." He raised a bony hand. "They tell me. I write them down." "Where are they now?" Cord looked at the floor. "Some come back. Some don't." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I got." Marlene stepped closer. "Were you near the clearing 3 days ago?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I heard crying." "Did you see the kids?" His mouth twitched. "No. But something did. Henry, I know how this looks. But I didn't touch them. I didn't take them. I've spent 20 years trying to keep the ones who come through here from going all the way in." "Into what?" He pointed out the window, past the trees, toward a ridge where the sun was bleeding gold over black. "Into where the forest doesn't end." Marlene stared at him. And for the first time in her career, just for a second, she didn't know if she was still asking about a crime. Keating stepped outside, radioing for forensics to sweep the place. But he already knew what they'd find. Nothing. No clothes, no food, no child's belongings. Just layers and layers of fear dressed up as warning. And something else, hanging above the bed. A drawing done in crayon. 2 kids, one in pink, one smaller, standing in front of a giant black tree. In the corner, a single initial. L. Marlene exhaled. Back at the command post, the doll sat in its sealed bag. And deep in the forest, the pool of mud remained untouched. But now it had a name, and that name was Henry Cord. By the time the sun dipped behind the pines, the air had gone cold, in that way only fear can explain. It wasn't night yet, not fully, but the forest had already begun to darken. Light didn't just fade here, it was swallowed. Emily stood behind the barricade tape, her hands trembling inside the sleeves of her jacket. She had been told firmly, officially, coldly, that she was not to join the night search. The terrain was too dangerous, the visibility too low, and emotions too high. But they didn't understand something simple. She wasn't part of the search. She was a mother. And mothers don't wait. The radio in the search tent crackled with another update. Nothing found. No new thermal traces. The dogs were being pulled back for rest. The drones were being recharged. The teams were going to regroup at dawn. But Emily wasn't listening anymore. She was walking, boots crunching across damp pine needles, stepping over roots, slipping through brush like a ghost, a woman chasing a flicker. Not of logic, of belief. No plan, no compass, just a feeling. She left her phone behind. Didn't tell Graham, didn't leave a note. All she took was a flashlight, her daughter's sweater, and the sound of Lily's voice in her memory, whispering bedtime wishes, singing off-key lullabies, calling for her brother between giggles. The deeper she went, the quieter it got. Even the birds had stopped singing. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Its yellow beam cut through the dark, like a fragile finger pointing at nothing. "Lily," she called. Silence. "Jack." Nothing. She walked faster. Branches slapped her arms. Brambles tore her jeans. Somewhere far behind, she thought she heard someone shout, but it was too faint, or too far. Or not real. The flashlight flickered again, then went out. "God, no," she fumbled, smacked it, shook it. The beam returned weaker this time. She exhaled sharply and kept going now, half running. Her foot caught something, a rock, a root, and she fell hard palms first into the mud. Pain shot up her arm. But worse than the pain was the sound that followed. A rustle. Low, slow, deliberate. Not wind, not animal. Something listening. She held her breath. Then with shaking fingers lifted the flashlight and swept it in a circle. Nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. Just the damp fog beginning to unroll itself across the ground like a shroud. She tried to stand, but her ankle gave out. She collapsed again, this time crying out loud. "Lily." It echoed once, then was gone. "Jack." The forest didn't answer. It didn't even bother. She crawled toward a rock and leaned against it, chest heaving. Her flashlight dimmed again. She slapped it hard. It flickered, then died. The dark took her. In the black, she began to murmur things. Prayers she hadn't said in years. Names she hadn't spoken since childhood. Apologies whispered into earth that would never return them. Then a sound. High, thin, fabric. She looked up, and in the faint light of the rising moon, caught between branches above her head, was something pale. She pushed to her knees, blinking hard. There, caught on a low-hanging limb, was a child's nightgown. Small, white, edged with pink lace. Emily reached for it with both arms outstretched, as if it were Lily herself. Her hands shook as they touched the fabric, damp, cold, fluttering. It was real. She clutched it to her chest. "Lily," she whispered. "Baby, I'm here. Mommy's here." But there was no reply. Just the groan of trees swaying overhead. She sat down in the mud again, gown balled in her fists, and wept. Not like a person. Like something breaking open. She lost time. Minutes, hours. By the time the searchers found her, it was almost morning. The dogs had picked up her scent, not the children's, just hers, and tracked her to the clearing where she sat like a statue at the base of a fallen birch. Graham was with them. He was the first to see her silhouette, hunched and shaking. "Emily," he shouted, running forward. She didn't move. He fell to his knees in front of her. "Oh my God, Emily, are you hurt?" She looked up. Her face was streaked with mud and tears. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if they'd forgotten how. "I found her nightgown," she whispered. Graham looked around. "What?" She held it out. The team took it gently, placing it in a bag. Marlene crouched beside her. "Where did you find it?" "Up there." Emily pointed. "On that branch." A tech raised his flashlight. Nothing. The branch was bare. No cloth, no sign of a snag. Just wet bark. "I swear," Emily said, voice trembling. "It was there. It was hers." "We believe you," Marlene said, but her voice was tight. "You don't." Emily snapped, sudden fire in her eyes. "None of you believe me. You think I'm breaking." "You're exhausted," Marlene said. "You're dehydrated." "It's cold." "No," Emily whispered. "It's not me. It's the woods. It's something in here." Her gaze flicked toward the trees, now glowing faintly with dawn. "I heard something last night. It wasn't an animal. It watched me." Graham put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't react. "I didn't imagine it," she said. "I know," he whispered. They wrapped her in blankets, gave her water, helped her stand. But even as they led her out, her eyes kept turning back again and again toward that tree, that branch, that spot, where something had once hung like a message, left for a mother who wouldn't stop looking. At the edge of the woods, just before they reached the clearing, Marlene stopped and looked back. Just trees, just fog, just morning breaking. But for half a second, she thought she saw movement. Not between the trunks. Above. She didn't mention it. Not yet, but she would remember. Long after the footage failed, long after the facts collapsed. She would remember the look in Emily's eyes when she said, "I saw her gown, and I think it wanted me to." The first officer stepped over the threshold with his breath held. The stench that greeted him was old wood, animal hair, dried herbs, and the sour note of something left too long in the dark. The interior of Henry Cord's cabin was a mausoleum of forgotten intentions. The structure itself groaned beneath its own weight, floorboards, swollen with damp walls leaning inward like they were trying to hear themselves whisper. But it was the walls that made them stop. Every inch of plaster, wood, and stone was covered in chalk. Not words, not scribbles. Children, crude outlines. Dozens, hundreds. Stick figures with hollow eyes and outstretched arms, some smiling, some faceless, some just heads floating in black space. Above them, floating shapes, trees, circles. What might have been moons or eyes watched from every angle. Marlene stepped in last, ducking beneath a string of hanging feathers. She stared at the nearest wall and said nothing. Sergeant Keating turned slowly in place, his hand hovering near his holster. "Jesus Christ, not his house." Henry's voice came from the back room. They turned. He stood there, leaning on a crooked cane, his expression unreadable. "I let you in, didn't I?" he said. "You said you wanted to look." "We did," Marlene replied calmly. "And we are." Henry nodded. "Then don't look with just your eyes." "What are we looking at?" Keating asked, eyes narrowing. "Is this some kind of confession?" "No," Henry said. "That's a record." "A record of what?" Henry walked forward slowly, tapping the cane as he passed the wall drawings. "Every one of them came through here. Some I saw, some I didn't. But I knew when they passed. The trees told me." Henry, Marlene said carefully. "Have you ever seen the Sullivan kids, Lily or Jack?" "I saw a shadow that looked like them." he answered. Running. Fast. But it wasn't them that scared me. It was what came after. Marlene took a step forward. What do you mean? He looked at her for the first time. His eyes were cloudy, yes, but not dull. There was awareness in them. I didn't take them, he said. I don't go near kids. Not after what happened in '99. Keating asked, what did happen in '99? Henry sighed, and for a moment he seemed smaller. There was a boy. Benny Myers, 5 years old, disappeared from a campground up north. I found his shoe near my cabin, brought it to the rangers. But they thought I put it there. And did you? No. Then why was it near your place? Henry didn't answer. He walked to the far corner of the room where the wall was painted black. On it, in stark white chalk, was a drawing of a large tree. Enormous, gnarled, monstrous, in shape with branches like grasping hands. Under it, 2 figures small. Children. Henry tapped the tree with his cane. It sleeps, he said. Marlene looked at him. What does... He didn't blink. The thing that lives beneath that tree. It's been asleep for 30 years. It stirs every time the wind howls just right. And when it does, kids go missing. Keating scoffed. You're saying there's a monster in the woods. I'm saying there's something here that doesn't belong in your paperwork. Have you ever seen it? Henry nodded once. When I was a boy. It looked at me and forgot me. Maybe because I wasn't scared. Maybe because it only wants the ones that run. Marlene studied him. You understand how this sounds, Henry? I do, he said softly. I know what people say. They think I'm crazy. That I live out here to hide. Don't you? He turned sharply. I live here because I listen. You all stopped listening a long time ago. The officers split off to search the rooms. They found no bed. Just a hammock strung across the ceiling beams. A wood stove. A pile of burned newspaper articles. All clippings about missing children. Why do you keep these? Wu asked. Henry shrugged. Because no one else does. Marlene opened a small drawer under a bench and found a collection of small objects. A marble, a cracked plastic ring, a charm bracelet missing half the letters. Trophies, or memories. She bagged them all. No blood, no clothing, no indication that Lilly or Jack had ever set foot here. But the drawings, the names. One caught her eye. Fresh chalk center wall. Lilly, Jack, 2025. She turned slowly. This is new. Henry didn't respond. You drew it after they disappeared. He nodded. How did you know their names? I didn't, he said. Until the wind told me. Keating stepped forward now, his voice tighter. You've got 2 missing kids? You've got their names on your walls. You've got a history. You better start giving us something we can hold. Henry closed his eyes. I can't give you what you want. I can only tell you what I know. Try. Henry opened his eyes again, and for the first time he looked afraid. I haven't slept in 3 days, he whispered. Not because of guilt, because it's awake again. I hear it scratching, moving. It's not hungry like you'd think. It's curious. It wants to know how they tick, why they run, what fear sounds like from the inside out. Keating had heard enough. He stepped back. We're bringing you in. For what? Henry asked. For questioning. You won't find anything, he said. I didn't take them. That's not what I'm worried about anymore, Marlene said quietly. Outside, as they led him to the cruiser, Henry looked up into the trees. It doesn't like being looked for, he muttered. You'll see. As they drove him down the winding road toward the station, the rain began again. Soft at first, then harder. Back in the cabin, the drawings on the walls, chalk vulnerable, began to run. The white streaks bled down the walls like tears, and in the corner of the black tree drawing something new began to appear. Not drawn, formed. A damp imprint. 2 handprints, very small, pressed into the wood. No one would see them for another 12 hours, but when they did, they would match Lily's. Exactly. Day 6. At this point in most missing child cases, hope has already begun to rot. It's not declared dead, but it is embalmed. Smiles in the search party tighten into habit. Conversations drop to whispers. Even the wind stops asking questions. But on the morning of the 6th day, just as the weather radio crackled with warnings of a storm barreling in, from the southeast, the drone team saw something. A single fleeting image, a pale blur between the trees, a white shape, child-sized, standing perfectly still on the edge of a moss-choked ravine deep in the northern sector Zone E, one of the least accessible areas. where the dogs had once stopped and refused to go, where Emily had once pointed with trembling fingers and whispered, "Something's in there." The footage was grainy, distorted by distance and angle, but not enough to kill the possibility. It looked like a little girl, and she was watching the drone. The moment the image was confirmed, the command post turned into chaos. Maps flung open. Radios hissed to life. Search captains barked coordinates, adjusting perimeter teams. Helicopter fuel checks, dog teams redirected. And Emily, she didn't wait for permission. She was already packing her boots, tightening her jacket, and staring at that black and white image on the screen, like it had been carved from her own ribs. "That's her," she said. "We can't be sure. That's my daughter." The storm was already whispering at the treetops, gray clouds thickening above the ridgeline. They had less than 4 hours before it swallowed the region in rain and wind. They didn't need time. They needed faith. Keating took command. Marlene moved beside Emily, clipping a walkie to her vest. "Stay near me. You go in, you follow orders." Emily didn't answer, because the truth was she would burn the whole forest down to get her child back. The team reached Zone E's outer boundary by noon. Axel, the K9, was back this time with a new handler, gentler hands. The dog seemed focused, but cautious. The air was thicker here, not just with storm pressure, but with something else. The trees bent inward like conspirators. Branches creaked in the wind like old bones settling. "We're getting close," Keating muttered, scanning the terrain. Then Axel stopped. Tail up, nose to the ground. And then he whined, but this time he moved forward. They followed. Every branch felt like a trap. Every gust of wind, a warning. Emily stumbled once, caught herself. The forest floor here was soggy, pocked with roots and old stones. The further they went, the more they saw signs that someone or something had been through recently. Broken twigs, disrupted moss, a small impression in the mud that might have been a foot. And then a structure, faint through the trees at first, then clearer. An abandoned shack half hidden under vines and rot, its roof sagging on one side like it had been injured by time. A single door, one shattered window. No sign of life. "Hold," Keating whispered. The team fanned out, weapons drawn not for people, for the unknown. Axel growled low and restrained. Emily stepped closer, and before anyone could stop her, she heard it. A sound, soft, muffled. Not wind, not animal. A whimper, a child's whimper. She ran. Marlene shouted, "Emily, wait!" But she was already at the door. She pushed it open. It creaked back with a scream of rust. Darkness inside. Dust in the beam of her flashlight. A smell of rot and dampness, and beneath it, something human. "Lily," she called out. Silence. "Jack." The flashlight moved across shattered furniture, broken crates and piles of leaves blown in over years of neglect. Then, from the back corner, a noise, a sniffle, then a soft, tiny cry. Emily stepped forward slowly, her body shaking so hard she had to brace herself on the wall. The light caught something in the corner. 2 small shapes, huddled, still. She dropped the flashlight. "Lily," she breathed. And then the voice came. "Mommy." It was broken, weak, but real. Emily collapsed to her knees, crawling forward. She reached out, and tiny arms flung themselves around her. It was Lily, dirty, thin, pale, but alive. And curled beside her, whimpering in the dark, was Jack, his face streaked with grime, holding the stuffed rabbit Emily had given him 6 mornings ago. Emily gathered them both, sobbing into their hair, whispering over and over again, "I'm here. I'm here. I'm here." The team flooded in behind her. Keating called for medics. Axel barked once, sharp, triumphant. Outside, the wind picked up. The first drops of rain began to fall. Marlene stood just outside the shack, staring up into the trees. They had been lucky. But something about the place made her uneasy. It wasn't just the children. It was the feeling that the shack had been waiting. And now that it was empty, it wasn't done. But for now, no one cared. Because for one heart-stopping, miraculous moment, hope had a face again. And her name was Lily Sullivan. Emily didn't want to let go. She held both children in the crook of her arms, as if the forest would try to steal them again the second she blinked. Lily's breath was shallow, and Jack's head lolled sleepily against her chest. Their clothes were soaked, torn, crusted with dirt. But they were warm. They were real. And they were alive. Rain had started in earnest, now pounding the roof of the old shack like fists from above. Outside, the search team worked in tense coordination. Blankets, med kits, stretchers. The urgency had shifted from panic to precision, but just beneath that was a hum. A tension, as if the forest had one more trick to play, and it did. As the medics moved inside, preparing to lift the children, a noise came from the shadows behind the broken furniture at the back of the shack. A creak, too deliberate to be the wind. Marlene spun first, flashlight raised. Keating followed, hand on his holster. Axel began growling again, fur stiff, tail straight. Emily froze. There, just behind the slatted wood and rotting insulation, a movement. Then a man burst forward, tall, dirty, beard matted, boots caked in swamp rot. He ran. "Go!" Keating shouted. Marlene darted left. The younger officers swarmed out the door. Axel lunged, but the man was already crashing through the underbrush, boots pounding into mud, scattering branches, and sending birds shrieking into the storm. Emily stared at his back disappearing between the trees, and recognition slammed into her like cold metal. Him, the gardener, Rick Morley. He had worked for the family 2 years ago. Quiet, odd, always too close to the kids. She had told Graham, had told the HOA, had even told the police, but no one had believed her. Not then, not until now. Marlene chased him through the storm heart, jackhammering. Rain lashed her face, turned the trail into a snake of slick leaves and ankle-deep mire. Her flashlight bobbed wildly. Keating was ahead of her, his boots tearing through vines, his voice lost in thunder. The man was fast. Panic made him fast. He zigzagged down a slope, leapt a fallen log, disappeared behind a curtain of hanging moss. "Stop!" Keating shouted. "You're surrounded." But Morley didn't stop. Because he wasn't thinking. He was running for his life. And in some twisted, inverted corner of his mind, he believed he was the victim. Emily emerged from the shack, soaked, trembling, still barefoot. She placed Lilly and Jack gently into the hands of the medic team, kissed their foreheads, and stood up with blood in her eyes. "I want to see him caught," she said. Marlene nodded once. "He's not getting away." The pursuit curved downhill into a part of the forest no one had mapped. Flashlights caught glimpses of bones, deer, maybe half buried in puddles. The storm intensified. Wind roared through the branches, tearing at coats and faces. Axel surged forward. Then he found him. Morley had stumbled, his ankle twisted. He had fallen hard into a ditch, bleeding from his cheek, one eye nearly swollen shut. "Don't move!" Keating barked, weapon drawn. But Morley lunged again, desperate. Marlene tackled him from the side, both of them slamming into the mud, her elbow striking bone. He screamed, twisted, tried to claw her eyes. But she didn't let go. Not this time. Rain poured over them. Mud seeped into mouths. Thunder cracked. Keating jumped in, handcuffed Morley with one arm behind his back. The man bucked and howled like something feral. "You don't know what it wanted," he shrieked. "It said it needed them. I didn't hurt them. I hid them. I saved them from the thing in the trees." No one answered, because no answer mattered now. He was done. The team returned to the shack with Morley zip-tied and flanked on both sides. Emily stood beneath a tarp, her face unreadable. He looked at her. "I told you," she said, her voice razor thin. "I told everyone." Morley opened his mouth. Emily stepped forward 1 inch from his face. "If you say one word to me, I will bury you in this forest myself." He didn't say a word. The medics loaded the children onto stretchers covered in blankets, IVs dripping. Emily walked beside them, one hand on each child's arm. As the team began the long walk back through the storm, camera crews arriving now. Sirens wailing in the distance, a drone hovered overhead, and it caught one frame, just one, of Emily, down on her knees, holding Lilly and Jack against her chest, crying silently, her face buried in their tangled hair. No sound, just the shape of a mother who refused to be broken, and the storm at last began to break. They put him in a windowless room with a single overhead bulb and a metal chair that shrieked when it moved. Rick Morley sat hunched over the table, his clothes still damp, dried blood clinging to a scab on his cheek. His wrists were cuffed, and his fingers tapped against the steel, rhythmically nervous, compulsive, pathetic. Marlene watched him from the other side of the glass, arms crossed, unmoving. "He's not going to last long," Keating said beside her. "He wants to talk. He just doesn't know how." "He doesn't need to know how," she replied. "He just needs to say what happened." They entered together. Marlene sat across from him. Keating leaned in the corner, silent. The camera above blinked red. A bottle of water sat untouched in front of Morley. "Tell me," Marlene said. Morley stared at the floor. "I didn't hurt them," he said. "No one said you did. I fed them. I kept them warm." "You took them." "They came into the woods," he said. "I just made sure they stayed there." "Why?" Morley looked up, his face pale and twitching. "They needed to learn. Kids these days, they don't understand fear. don't respect the woods, don't listen. Marlene didn't flinch. So you kidnapped 2 children to teach them a lesson. His mouth twisted into something between shame and pride. I wasn't going to keep them. I was going to bring them back. Just wanted them quiet for a while. You knew their parents were searching. You knew what they were going through. I saw it on the news, and you still didn't come forward. Morley's eyes flickered. I thought maybe they'd listen next time. Maybe they'd understand that not everything gets handed back right away. Marlene leaned forward. But it's not the first time, is it? Silence. We searched your place, she continued. We found 24 items, all child-sized. Toys, socks, a necklace with the name Benny carved on the back. Morley's jaw clenched. You've done this before, she said. I didn't touch them, he snapped. Not one of them. Keating stepped forward. Doesn't make you a saint. Makes you a coward with delusions, Marlene added quietly. Or worse, a man who believes punishment equals power. Morley didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. The tapes would roll. The evidence would mount. The name Rick Morley would become another cautionary tale stitched into the skin of a town already covered in scars. Outside the station, Emily sat alone in the back of an ambulance, watching her children sleep side by side under thermal blankets. Jack's hand was still clutching the ear of his stuffed rabbit. Lily's lips were slightly parted, a pink scratch visible down her cheek. She hadn't let go of them for more than 5 minutes since the rescue. Now, as the rain softened into mist, she finally did. She stepped out, boots sinking into wet gravel, and stood facing the edge of the parking lot where Graham was waiting, hands in pockets, head down, like a boy about to be grounded. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and he did something she'd never seen him do before. He cried. Not loud, not performative, but it was there. Tears running down the lines of his face, his shoulders rising in shallow heaves. I should have listened to you, he said. She didn't answer. I thought you were paranoid. I thought you were just tired. I made you feel crazy. Still, she said nothing. I failed them, he whispered, and I failed you. Only then did she speak. Her voice was soft, but there was nothing weak in it. I screamed into the void for 2 years. About that man, about the cracks, about the quiet parts of our life that were falling apart while we pretended to hold it together. I know, he said. And if you just heard me just once, this wouldn't have happened. I know. Silence settled between them. And then she stepped forward, wrapped her arms around him. Not gently, not like forgiveness, but like release. And Graham broke. Right there in the stormlight, in front of the empty ambulance, in front of the cops and the medics and the trees. They stood wrapped in each other's failures. And it didn't fix anything, but it opened something. Later in the temporary trauma room at the regional hospital, Emily sat beside Lily's bed while doctors checked her vitals. Graham paced near the door, fingers running through his hair. A social worker came in, asked routine questions. Was there food? Yes. Were they touched? No. Did they see anything else? Lily stirred, whispered something. Emily leaned in. What, baby? Lily's voice was dry but clear. He told us if we made noise, the trees would get closer. Emily blinked. Who did? The man with the smell, she said. He said the forest had rules. Emily nodded, brushing her daughter's hair. And Jack, she asked softly. Lily looked over. He just kept saying your name. Emily's throat tightened. And I kept singing to him, Lily said, eyes fluttering closed. Like you used to. A nurse came in, said they'd need rest. Emily nodded and stood. She walked out into the hallway where Graham was waiting, and she took his hand. It was small. It was clumsy. It was a beginning. Back at the station, Marlene sat alone at her desk, reviewing the files. The chalk drawings, the cabin logs, the recorded confession, and she thought about what Henry Cord had said in the cabin. It's been here for 30 years, and it doesn't sleep anymore. She opened a new file, titled it Unexplained, Unresolved, Zone E, and beneath it, she wrote 2 words, not closed, because even now with the children found the monster jailed, and the story headed for national news. Something about the woods didn't feel finished, but for the family, for now, it was enough. They had pain, they had truth, and they were starting to have each other again, which some would argue was the beginning of everything. 6 months later, Nova Scotia wore winter-like memory, quiet, layered waiting. Snowfall had begun again in the hills around Lansdowne Station. This time it felt less like erasure and more like punctuation, as if the earth itself had chosen to close a chapter. The house at the edge of the woods looked different now. New paint, a sturdier fence, cameras discreetly placed under the eaves. But the biggest change couldn't be seen from the outside. It lived in the way they walked through the hallways, now together. The way the light in the kitchen no longer flickered when someone cried. The way Graham poured coffee without trembling. The way Emily exhaled long and deep, as if she were finally breathing for real. She stood in the living room holding a hardback book in both hands. The cover was soft blue. A drawing of two children standing in a pool of light. The title written in delicate serif font, Lily's Light, by Emily and Graham Sullivan. Inside, the story was told not like a report or a crime log, but like a confession to the world. A plea. A chronicle of what happens when silence is allowed to grow between people and what kind of monsters can take root in that space. Chapter titles included The Fence Was Always Broken, The Dog That Wouldn't Step Forward, The Nightgown on the Branch, What the Wind Told Me. It wasn't about blame. It was about watching better, listening harder, remembering that children don't always speak the language of danger in full sentences. And it was already making waves. Local schools requested copies. Mental health advocates called it a raw and vital tool. But none of that mattered to Emily, as much as the moment she walked into the den and saw Lily reading it aloud to Jack, his head resting on her shoulder, both of them wrapped in the same red blanket. Lily stumbled on a sentence. Emily knelt beside her. That word is vanish, sweetie. Lily frowned. I don't like that word. I don't either, Emily whispered. But you made sure it didn't stay true. That evening they drove up to the trailhead, just past the last guard post, where the forest opened wide like a reluctant mouth. The path had been cleared. Markers set. It was no longer unnamed. A sign had been installed. Lily and Jack's Trail, for every child who needs a way back. The family walked in silence, their boots crunching snow, the breath from their mouths rising like prayers. At the clearing, the place had all ended and began again. Graham opened a backpack and pulled out 4 sky lanterns. Emily lit the first. She handed it to Lily. Lily paused, stared at the flame inside, then whispered, I want to send this to the girl who didn't make it home. Emily blinked. What girl? The one I saw in the woods, Lily said softly. She had no shoes. I tried to give her mine, but she walked away. Emily nodded slowly. They didn't press further. Instead, they lifted the lantern into the cold night air. Jack's was next. His lantern wobbled, caught the wind, and sailed up faster than expected. Mine's racing to the stars, he shouted and laughed. Graham's hands were shaking when he lit his. He held it for a long moment before letting it go. Thank you, he whispered to no one and everyone at once. Emily lit the final lantern, held it, then placed it in front of her children. You two are my miracle, she said. Jack looked up. What's a miracle? Something that shouldn't have happened, but it did. He smiled. Like us. She nodded. And they let the last one go together. 4 lights rose into the sky, flickering above the tree line, climbing like wishes that refused to stay grounded. The forest below was silent, but no longer menacing. Not anymore. It had seen too much, taken too much, and now finally it had given something back. As the family watched the lanterns drift, the camera would pull slowly away, wide, then wider, until the family became 4 small shapes beneath a canopy of black trees and white snow. Fragile, alive, together. And just before the screen faded to black, Emily's voice would echo softly. There are miracles that don't come from the sky, but from a mother's heart that refuses to stop beating. Fade out. Credits roll. Silence. And somewhere, in a classroom or a hospital or a lonely home, at the edge of some other forest, someone picks up Lily's Light and begins to read. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a child whispers something too soft to notice, someone will hear it,